The small cabin stood alone against the vast Montana landscape, smoke curling from its chimney like a question mark against the gray winter sky. Thomas Harrington moved slowly around his kitchen, the limp in his right leg more pronounced in the cold weather. At 57, the lines on his weathered face told stories of both joy and heartbreak, but the last 2 years had etched the deepest marks. Through the kitchen window, Thomas watched Max, his 3-year-old German shepherd, racing through the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The dog's powerful body moved with a grace that always amazed Thomas, his dark coat standing out sharply against the white background. Every few minutes, Max would stop, nose raised to catch some invisible scent, before bounding off in another direction. "At least one of us still has energy," Thomas muttered, smiling despite himself. The quiet of his small home was something Thomas had never quite gotten used to. After 30 years of marriage, the absence of Helen's voice still felt wrong somehow. 2 years since cancer took her, yet he sometimes found himself turning to share a thought with her, only to face the empty space where she should have been. Max had been Helen's idea. Every country home needs a good dog, she had insisted during her final months. Thomas had reluctantly agreed, more to bring a smile to her fading face than from any desire for canine companionship. He'd never expected the gangly puppy with oversized paws to become his lifeline. Thomas poured himself another cup of coffee and reached for his medication. Outside, Max had found something interesting buried beneath the snow and was digging frantically, white powder flying in all directions. The sight made Thomas chuckle. The dog's enthusiasm for even the smallest discoveries was something Thomas envied. The ringing phone broke the morning quiet. Thomas limped across the kitchen to answer it, already knowing who it would be. "Morning. Dad, just checking in." His daughter's voice came through, warm but with that undercurrent of worry she'd never been able to hide. "Jenny, I'm fine. Same as yesterday and the day before," Thomas replied, trying to keep the defensiveness from his voice. "Max and I are doing just fine." I know. But it's supposed to get down to -10 tonight. That's serious cold." Thomas glanced out the window again. "I've got plenty of firewood, enough food for a month, and the truck's running fine if I need to go into town. How's Max doing?" Jenny asked, changing tactics. At the mention of the dog, Thomas's voice softened. "Currently digging up my yard looking for who knows what. Probably a buried stick he forgot about." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. Jenny telling him about her kids, her husband's promotion, life in the city that seemed a world away from his quiet existence. Thomas listened, offering the appropriate responses, but his eyes kept drifting to the window where Max was now sitting alertly, watching the tree line at the edge of the property. "I should let you go, Dad. Just call if you need anything." "Promise?" "I promise," Thomas said, knowing they both recognized it as a partial truth. He'd always been too proud to ask for help, a trait that had driven Helen crazy during their marriage. After hanging up, Thomas bundled up in his heavy coat, wool hat, and gloves. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the porch, but Max immediately noticed his appearance and came bounding over, tail wagging so hard his entire body seemed to sway with it. "What were you looking at, boy?" Thomas asked, reaching down to ruffle the thick fur around Max's neck. The dog pressed against his legs, nearly knocking him off balance. "Careful there, you're stronger than you think." Thomas made his way carefully down the porch steps, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The last thing he needed was a fall out here, miles from help. Max circled him impatiently, eager for their morning routine. Their property stretched across 5 acres bordered by dense forest on 2 sides. Thomas had bought the land with Helen 30 years ago, dreaming of a family home away from the noise and pressure of city life. Now in retirement, the isolation sometimes felt like both a blessing and a curse. "Come on then," Thomas said, starting toward the small storage shed about 50 yards from the house. Max shot ahead, then circled back as if checking that Thomas was still following. The dog repeated this pattern several times on their short journey, boundless energy on display. Inside the shed, Thomas filled Max's food bowl and refreshed his water while the dog sat watching, his discipline impressive despite his obvious hunger. Only when Thomas gave the quiet command, "Okay," did Max lower his head to eat. "Good boy," Thomas murmured, taking a moment to check the thermometer hanging on the shed wall. Already 25 degrees and the sun was barely up. Jenny was right about the cold front moving in. Thomas inspected Max's outdoor kennel, making sure the insulation was holding up. He'd built it himself last winter, a sturdy wooden structure with thick walls and a raised floor to keep out the cold. The interior was lined with special insulating material, and Thomas had even installed a small heating pad that activated in extreme temperatures. Max spent nights here when the weather wasn't too severe, though Thomas increasingly found himself allowing the dog to sleep inside the cabin. "You're getting soft," Helen would have teased him. "That dog's going to be sleeping on our bed next." Thomas smiled at the thought. She'd been right, as usual. On the coldest nights, Max did end up on the bed, his warm body a comfort Thomas wouldn't have admitted needing. While Max finished eating, Thomas checked the fasteners on the kennel door and cleared away some snow that had drifted against the side. The structure was solid, he'd made sure of that, but the Montana winter demanded constant vigilance. "All set," Thomas said as Max finished his breakfast. The dog looked up, intelligent eyes fixed on Thomas with what always felt like understanding. Sometimes Thomas talked to Max more than he'd talked to most people, telling the dog about his worries, his memories, the ache that never quite left his chest when he thought of Helen. Back at the cabin, Thomas settled into his morning routine. He built up the fire, prepared a simple breakfast, and reviewed the list of chores he'd set for himself. Max claimed his usual spot near the fireplace, sprawled on the braided rug Helen had made years ago. The quiet companionship between man and dog had developed naturally. Max seemed to sense Thomas's mood, staying close on the hardest days, giving space when needed. For his part, Thomas found comfort in the simple responsibility of caring for another living thing. It gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together. By mid-morning, Thomas bundled up again to check his mail. The mailbox was positioned at the end of their long driveway, almost a quarter-mile walk from the cabin. In good weather, Thomas enjoyed the stroll, but winter made it a more challenging journey. Max trotted beside him as they made their way down the snow-covered drive, occasionally darting off to investigate something interesting hidden beneath the white blanket covering everything. The sky had cleared, revealing a brilliant blue that almost hurt to look at, the sun reflecting off the snow with diamond brightness. "Mail's probably not even worth the walk," Thomas grumbled. But the truth was he welcomed these small excursions. They broke up the day, gave him purpose. The mailbox yielded the usual: a few bills, a farming catalog, and a postcard from Jenny's family from their holiday trip the month before. Thomas tucked everything into his coat pocket for review back in the warmth of his cabin. On the return journey, Max suddenly froze, ears perked forward, body tense with alertness. Thomas followed the dog's gaze toward the tree line but saw nothing unusual among the snow-laden pines. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked quietly. Max gave a low whine but remained focused on the trees. After a moment, a large doe stepped cautiously from the forest edge, her brown coat stark against the snow. She paused, sensing their presence, then bounded gracefully back into the protection of the trees. "Just looking for food, like the rest of us," Thomas said. Max relaxed, looking up at Thomas as if to confirm they were continuing their walk. These small moments, watching wildlife, observing the changing seasons, sharing quiet companionship with Max, had slowly healed something in Thomas that he'd thought broken beyond repair. He wasn't the same man he'd been with Helen, couldn't be, but he was finding his way toward something new. As they approached the cabin, the sun caught the windows, making them glow like warm beacons. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, gratitude mixed with grief, the knowledge that he'd built this life with Helen but now walked it alone. Except he wasn't completely alone. Max nudged his hand with a cold nose as if sensing his thoughts turning inward. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears, receiving a look of pure contentment in return. "Let's get inside," Thomas said. "Got enough wood to chop this afternoon to keep us both warm tonight." Max barked once in what Thomas chose to interpret as agreement, then raced ahead to wait patiently at the door, the loyal companion who had, without warning or intent, become the center of Thomas Harrington's quiet world. The day slipped away as winter days often do. Too quickly, the sun beginning its descent by mid-afternoon. Thomas had spent hours chopping and stacking firewood, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Though his body protested with each swing of the axe, there was satisfaction in the growing pile of split logs that would keep his cabin warm through the coming cold snap. Max had stayed nearby throughout the afternoon, occasionally disappearing into the tree line only to return minutes later as if checking that Thomas was still there. The temperature had been dropping steadily since noon, and now, as the sky darkened to deep purple, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. "Time to head in," Thomas called to Max, who was investigating something at the edge of the property. The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but unusually he didn't immediately come running. Thomas whistled sharply, and this time Max trotted over, though something about his gait seemed hesitant. Thomas frowned slightly. "What's gotten into you?" Inside the cabin, Thomas stoked the fire and prepared a simple dinner, a bowl of hearty beef stew he'd made the day before. He spooned some over Max's kibble, a treat the dog never refused. But tonight Max merely sniffed at his food bowl and walked away, settling by the window instead, his eyes fixed on something outside. "Not hungry?" Thomas asked, concerned. He crossed the room and knelt beside the dog, running his hands over Max's body, checking for any signs of injury or discomfort. Nothing seemed physically wrong. "You feeling okay, boy?" Max whined softly, pressing his head against Thomas's hand but keeping his gaze toward the window. Outside, darkness had fully settled in, and the first flakes of new snow were beginning to fall, visible in the yellow glow of the porch light. Thomas's phone buzzed, a weather alert. He checked the screen and grimaced. The storm was moving in faster than predicted, with temperatures expected to plummet well below zero overnight. He texted Jenny a quick message assuring her he was prepared before she could call worried. "Looks like it's going to be a rough one," he told Max. The dog had finally returned to his food bowl and was eating, though with less enthusiasm than usual. Thomas took it as a good sign and finished his own dinner, listening to the wind as it grew stronger, whistling around the corners of the cabin. By 8 o'clock, the storm was in full force. Snow blew horizontally past the windows and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Thomas added more logs to the fire, grateful for the solid walls of his cabin and the warmth within. "Time for bed soon," he told Max, who had been pacing between the window and door for the past hour. The dog's restlessness was unusual, especially on a stormy night when he typically preferred to stay close to the fire. At 9:30, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and boots. Despite the intensifying storm, he needed to make sure Max's kennel was secure and that the dog would be comfortable for the night. Though he often let Max sleep inside during bad weather, the forecast mentioned the possibility of power outages, and Thomas wanted to be sure the kennel was ready just in case. "I'll be right back," he told Max, who watched him with unusual intensity. "Just gonna check your house out there." The moment he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked Thomas back. Snow stung his face as he stepped onto the porch, bracing himself against the railing. Max pushed past him, leaping into the swirling snow before Thomas could stop him. "Max, come back," he called, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. The beam of Thomas's flashlight caught Max standing in the yard, snow already accumulating on his dark fur. Thomas struggled down the steps, cursing his stiff leg as he made his way toward the dog. "Come on, boy. Inside!" But Max turned and trotted toward his kennel, stopping about 20 feet away from it. Thomas followed, relieved that at least the dog hadn't run off into the woods. The kennel appeared secure, the small heat lamp he'd installed glowing dimly through the small window Thomas had added for ventilation. "See, all ready for you," Thomas said, reaching Max and gesturing toward the kennel. "Though you can come inside tonight if you want." Max looked from Thomas to the kennel and back again. Then, to Thomas's surprise, when he took a step toward the kennel, Max barked sharply, a warning sound Thomas had rarely heard from him. "What is it?" Thomas asked, confused. He approached the kennel himself, thinking perhaps a branch had fallen on it or something was blocking the entrance. Max barked again, more urgently this time, and when Thomas continued forward, the dog darted in front of him, blocking his path. "Max, what's gotten into you?" Thomas tried to move around the dog, but Max shifted to stay between him and the kennel, his body tense, ears flattened against his head. Thomas played his flashlight over the kennel's exterior. Nothing seemed amiss. The structure stood solid against the wind, its door slightly ajar as he'd left it earlier that day. Snow had drifted against one side, but not enough to cause concern. "It's fine, boy, see?" Thomas tried again to approach, and again Max blocked him, this time with a low growl that raised the hair on the back of Thomas's neck. In 3 years, Max had never growled at him. Thomas took a step back, genuinely puzzled. All right, We'll leave it for now. He turned back toward the cabin, expecting Max to follow, but when he looked back, the dog remained where he was, eyes fixed on the kennel, body rigid with what Thomas now recognized as fear. "Max, come," Thomas called firmly, using the command that had never failed before. Max looked at him, clearly torn between obedience and whatever was keeping him rooted to that spot. After a moment of hesitation, the dog took a few steps toward Thomas, then stopped and looked back at the kennel. "Inside. Now," Thomas said, pointing toward the cabin. Reluctantly, Max followed him back to the porch but stopped at the bottom of the steps, turning once more to stare at the kennel in the distance. Thomas stood in the doorway, snow collecting on his shoulders, watching his dog with growing concern. "Max, please come inside," he called, his voice softer now. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out in the morning." But Max would not come. Instead, he circled a spot in the yard, pawing at the accumulating snow before finally lying down, his eyes never leaving the kennel. Thomas couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You can't stay out here. It's freezing and getting worse." As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind tore through the yard, bringing with it a blinding sheet of snow. Thomas squinted against it, momentarily losing sight of Max. When the air cleared slightly, he saw the dog hadn't moved, snow already beginning to gather on his dark fur. Thomas considered going out to physically bring Max inside, but his leg was throbbing from the cold, and something told him that Max might resist, something the dog had never done before. The whole situation felt wrong in a way Thomas couldn't explain. "Fine," he said finally, frustration mixing with worry. "Have it your way. But the door's staying open when you decide to stop being stubborn." Thomas retreated inside but left the door cracked open enough for Max to enter if he changed his mind. He added more wood to the fire and settled in his chair by the window, where he could watch Max, illuminated dimly by the porch light and the occasional sweep of his flashlight. The minutes ticked by, becoming an hour, then 2. Outside, the storm intensified. Thomas dozed briefly, waking with a start to find that Max had moved closer to the house but was still refusing to come inside. The dog had created a small depression in the snow where he lay, his body curled tight against the cold, but his eyes remained fixed on the distant kennel. "This is ridiculous," Thomas muttered, checking the time. Nearly midnight. He pulled his coat back on and grabbed a blanket from the couch. His leg protested as he made his way back into the storm, which had somehow grown even fiercer in the short time he'd been inside. Max watched his approach but didn't move from his snow nest. When Thomas reached him, he draped the blanket over the dog's snow-covered body. "You're being incredibly stubborn, you know that?" Max whined softly but made no move to follow Thomas back to the house. With a sigh of defeat, Thomas returned to his vigil by the window. Whatever was bothering Max, it was clear the dog wasn't going to be coaxed away from his self-appointed post. Throughout the night, Thomas checked on Max regularly, bringing out fresh blankets as the others became soaked with snow. Each time he tried to persuade the dog to come inside, and each time Max refused, his determination unwavering despite the increasingly harsh conditions. During one of these checks, around 3 in the morning, Thomas noticed that Max had shifted position slightly, moving even closer to the cabin but still maintaining his line of sight to the kennel. The dog was shivering visibly now despite the layers of blankets. "Please, Max," Thomas pleaded, kneeling in the snow beside him. "Whatever's wrong, we'll deal with it tomorrow. You need to come inside now." Max looked at him, eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, and for a moment Thomas thought the dog might finally relent. Instead, Max let out another low whine and turned his gaze back to the kennel, now barely visible through the swirling snow. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that Max was trying to tell him something important, something about the kennel that the dog could sense but he could not. As dawn approached, bringing with it no break in the storm, Thomas sat huddled in his coat on the porch steps, keeping watch alongside his faithful companion who, despite hours in the freezing cold, had not abandoned his vigil. Morning came with no real change in light, just a gradual fading of darkness into a dull, gray glow behind the curtain of falling snow. Thomas had dozed off in his chair by the window, his neck stiff and painful as he jerked awake. Immediately, his eyes sought Max in the yard. For one terrifying moment, Thomas couldn't see the dog through the thick snowfall. He pressed his face closer to the cold glass, breath fogging the window. Then he spotted the dark shape, now almost completely covered in white, still maintaining his position facing the kennel. "Stubborn fool," Thomas muttered, though the words held more worry than annoyance now. He pulled on his boots, coat, and gloves, wrapping a scarf around his lower face before stepping out into the biting cold. The temperature display on his porch read 15 below zero, and that didn't account for the wind chill. As he struggled through the knee-deep snow toward Max, Thomas felt genuine fear tightening his chest. No dog should be out in this weather for so long. "Max?" he called, his voice carried away by the wind. The snow-covered form stirred, and Max raised his head. Even from several feet away, Thomas could see the dog was shivering violently. Snow had accumulated on Max's fur, forming a thick crust that the dog seemed too exhausted to shake off. "That's it," Thomas said firmly. "I don't care what's bothering you. You're coming inside now." He reached down to grab Max's collar, prepared for resistance, but the dog was too cold to put up much of a fight. Still, when Thomas tried to lead him toward the house, Max whined and pulled back, casting anxious glances toward the kennel. "No," Thomas said, tugging more insistently. "Inside now." With obvious reluctance, Max allowed himself to be led up the porch steps and through the door. Once inside, he immediately went to the window, placing his front paws on the sill to look out at the kennel, barely visible through the storm. Thomas quickly toweled the snow from Max's fur, checking his paws and ears for signs of frostbite. The dog was ice-cold to the touch, but didn't appear to have any serious injuries from his night in the elements. Still, Thomas wrapped him in a warm blanket and tried to coax him closer to the fire. "You could have frozen to death out there," Thomas scolded gently, running his hands over Max's back. "What were you thinking?" Max whined again, turning his gaze back to the window. I know. Something's wrong with your kennel," Thomas said, following the dog's line of sight. "But it'll have to wait until this storm breaks." As if in defiance of his words, the wind outside intensified, rattling the windows. Thomas checked his phone and found no signal. The storm had knocked out cell service. The power was still on, thankfully, but Thomas knew better than to count on it staying that way. He moved to the kitchen to fill several containers with water just in case. When he returned to the living room, Max was nowhere to be seen. "Max?" Thomas called, a note of panic in his voice. A cold draft answered him, and he turned to see the front door ajar, snow already drifting across the threshold. Thomas swore and rushed to the door, spotting Max's tracks leading back into the yard. "Max!" he shouted into the howling wind. "Max, come back." Through the white haze, Thomas could just make out the dog's dark shape, once again taking up position in the yard, eyes fixed on the distant kennel. This time, however, Max had moved slightly closer to the structure, as if gathering his courage for something. Thomas struggled down the porch steps, his bad leg nearly buckling as he hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. The wind cut through his coat like it wasn't even there, and he could feel his exposed skin burning with cold. If it was this bad for him with proper winter clothing, how must it feel for Max? "Max, please," he called, his words nearly inaudible over the storm. The dog turned to look at him, and even through the curtain of snow between them, Thomas could see the intensity in his eyes. There was something almost human in the way Max was trying to communicate, and for the first time real unease prickled along Thomas's spine. He changed direction, moving not toward Max but toward the kennel. If there was something wrong there, he needed to know what it was. Behind him, he heard Max barking frantically, but Thomas pressed on, leaning into the wind. He had nearly reached the kennel when Max suddenly appeared at his side, cutting in front of him and blocking his path just as he had the night before. The dog's teeth were bared now, his bark deeper and more threatening than Thomas had ever heard. "Max, stop it." "Let me see." Thomas tried to step around the dog, but Max moved with him, his message unmistakable. "Go no further." In the face of such determination, Thomas hesitated. This wasn't normal behavior, not for any dog, and certainly not for Max. A particularly violent gust of wind nearly knocked Thomas off his feet, and he staggered backward. The cold was becoming dangerous now. He could feel his extremities growing numb despite his gloves and boots. "Fine," he conceded, "but you're coming with me this time." Before Max could resist, Thomas grabbed his collar firmly and began dragging him toward the house. The dog fought him every step of the way, digging his paws into the snow and pulling back with surprising strength for an animal that had spent the night in freezing temperatures. By the time they reached the porch, Thomas was out of breath and his hands were dangerously numb even through his gloves. He practically pushed Max through the door before slamming it shut behind them, this time turning the lock. "That's enough," he told the dog sternly. "You're staying inside if I have to tie you to the radiator." Max paced anxiously by the door, whining and occasionally throwing himself against it, but Thomas ignored him. He built up the fire, made himself a strong cup of coffee and tried to warm his half-frozen hands. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Throughout the morning, Max alternated between pressing his face to the window and scratching at the door. His distress was obvious, and despite his frustration, Thomas couldn't help feeling concerned. In 3 years, he had never seen Max act this way. By noon, the power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Thomas wasn't surprised. In these conditions, it was a wonder it had lasted as long as it did. He had plenty of firewood to keep the cabin warm and battery-powered lamps for light. His bigger concern was Max, who had not settled down at all and seemed, if anything, more agitated as the hours passed. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside the dog. "What's out there that's got you so worked up?" Max whined and pawed at the window, leaving scratches on the wooden sill. Thomas peered out again at the kennel, barely visible now through the storm and gathering darkness. Was there something moving out there? No, it had to be a trick of the light, or rather the lack of it. As the day wore on and darkness fell once more, Thomas began to wonder if he was missing something important. Max's behavior was too deliberate, too persistent to be dismissed as mere animal anxiety. The dog knew something, sensed something that Thomas could not. He found himself studying the kennel through his binoculars, searching for any sign of what might be causing Max's distress. From this distance and through the falling snow, he could make out little more than the outline of the structure and the faint gleam of the battery-powered heat lamp he'd installed inside. Wait, the heat lamp. If that was still working, then the kennel would be the warmest place in the yard. And if that was the case, Thomas lowered the binoculars, a new concern forming in his mind. What if some animal had sought shelter in the kennel? A raccoon, perhaps, or even a coyote? That would explain Max's reluctance to approach it. But no, that didn't make sense either. Max wasn't afraid of other animals. If anything, he was too eager to chase them. And besides, any wild creature would have fled when Thomas approached the kennel the previous night. As darkness deepened outside, Thomas lit several oil lamps and placed them around the cabin. The fire in the hearth provided most of the heat now, and he pulled his chair closer to it, encouraging Max to lie nearby. The dog complied but remained alert, his eyes constantly moving between Thomas and the window. "Try to get some rest," Thomas told him, scratching behind Max's ears. "Whatever it is, it'll still be there in the morning." But even as he said the words, Thomas wasn't sure he believed them. Something about this situation felt increasingly wrong, a nagging sense of dread that he couldn't quite shake. Throughout the evening, he found himself returning to the window, straining to see through the darkness and swirling snow. Several times he thought he caught a glimpse of movement near the kennel, but it was impossible to be sure. The storm played tricks on the eyes, turning shadows into shapes and back again. Max noticed each time Thomas looked outside, his ears perking up, body tensing as if ready to bolt for the door should it open. By midnight, both man and dog were exhausted, but neither seemed able to relax. Thomas dozed fitfully in his chair, waking whenever Max moved or whined. The dog had taken up position directly in front of the door now, as if standing guard against something only he could sense. In the early hours of the morning, Thomas woke to absolute silence. The howling wind had stopped, and the only sound was the soft crackling of the fire. He sat up momentarily disoriented, then realized what had changed. The storm had finally broken. Max was already at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared intently outside. Thomas joined him, surprised to see stars visible in patches between scattered clouds. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie blue light over the snow-covered landscape. And there, perfectly illuminated in the moonlight, stood the kennel, its dark shape stark against the white background. Nothing moved around it. Nothing suggested any reason for concern. Yet Max's body was rigid with tension, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he stared at the structure. "We'll check it at first light," Thomas promised, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. When dawn finally came, crisp and clear after the storm, Thomas was already dressed and ready. Max hadn't left his post by the window all night, and now the dog watched intently as Thomas pulled on his boots and coat. "Ready?" Thomas asked, reaching for the door handle. Max's answer was immediate, a sharp bark and a stance that suggested he was prepared for whatever might come next. As Thomas opened the door to the new day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was waiting to be discovered, something that would explain the strange, unwavering vigilance of his loyal companion. The morning air was painfully cold but perfectly still, a sharp contrast to the howling chaos of the night before. Every surface glittered under a thick blanket of fresh snow, and the world had that muffled quality that comes after a heavy snowfall, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the white landscape. Thomas stepped carefully off the porch, testing the depth of the snow before committing his weight. It came up nearly to his knees in places, and he wished he'd thought to put on his snowshoes. Beside him, Max moved with surprising energy for a dog who'd spent most of the night awake and vigilant. The German Shepherd cut through the snow with determination, no longer blocking Thomas's path to the kennel but still keeping slightly ahead, his body language tense and alert. "Easy now," Thomas said, as much to himself as to Max. They approached the kennel slowly, Thomas's leg aching with each step through the deep snow. The silence around them felt almost unnatural after the constant roar of the storm, broken only by the squeak of snow beneath Thomas's boots and Max's occasional snort as he cleared snow from his nostrils. About 20 feet from the kennel, Max stopped abruptly, his ears forward, tail straight out behind him. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, though by now he was certain there was something in or around the kennel, something that Max considered a threat. He scanned the area carefully, looking for tracks in the snow, but saw nothing except their own trail leading from the cabin. Whatever had Max so concerned, it must have been there before the storm hit. Thomas considered his options. He could get his rifle from the cabin, but the thought of shooting at or near Max's kennel didn't sit well with him. Besides, if it was just a raccoon or squirrel that had sought shelter, he'd feel foolish for overreacting. "Stay," he commanded Max, who whined in protest but obeyed, watching intently as Thomas continued forward alone. The kennel stood exactly as Thomas had built it, a solid wooden structure about 4 feet high and 6 feet long, with a slanted roof now covered in snow. The small window he'd installed in the side was partially obscured by a drift, but Thomas could see the faint glow of the battery-powered heat lamp still functioning inside. He approached cautiously, all his senses alert. There was no sound from within the kennel, no movement that he could detect. The door hung partially open just as he'd left it 2 nights ago. Thomas reached for it, then hesitated, suddenly reluctant to look inside. Behind him, Max barked once, a sharp warning sound. Thomas turned to see the dog had moved closer, despite his command to stay, his body rigid with tension, eyes fixed on the kennel door. "It's all right," Thomas said, though he didn't feel particularly confident. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." Taking a deep breath, he pulled the door open wider and bent down to look inside. The kennel's interior was dim despite the heat lamp, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The familiar bedding was there, a thick pad covered with an old blanket, arranged in the corner farthest from the small window to provide maximum warmth and shelter. At first, Thomas saw nothing unusual, and he began to wonder if Max's behavior had been triggered by something that was no longer there. Then as he leaned in further, a slight movement caught his eye, a small shifting in the shadows along the back wall of the kennel. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat as the shape moved again. Something was definitely in there, partially hidden beneath the edge of the blanket, something that didn't belong. He reached slowly for the flashlight in his coat pocket, never taking his eyes off the spot where he'd seen movement. Behind him, Max's growling had grown louder, more insistent. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dimness, illuminating the interior of the kennel in harsh detail. And there, coiled tightly in the corner on top of Max's bedding, was the last thing Thomas expected to see. A rattlesnake. Thomas jerked backward so quickly he lost his footing and fell into the snow. The snake, disturbed by the sudden light and movement, raised its head and rattled a warning, the distinctive sound sending a chill down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Christ almighty," Thomas breathed, scrambling backward through the snow. A rattler. In December, Max barked furiously now, darting forward a few steps before retreating again. clearly conflicted between protecting Thomas and maintaining a safe distance from the snake. Thomas got to his feet, never taking his eyes off the kennel entrance, though the snake remained inside, apparently reluctant to venture into the snow. His mind raced. Rattlesnakes were common enough in the area during summer months, but they typically hibernated through winter. This one must have been disturbed from its den somehow, or perhaps it had been hiding in the woodpile, and Thomas had unknowingly brought it near the kennel. However it had gotten there, the snake had clearly found the warmth of the heated kennel irresistible in the freezing temperatures and had made itself at home in Max's bed. And Max had known. Somehow, without ever seeing inside, the dog had sensed the danger and had been trying desperately to warn Thomas. Not just warn him, but protect him from it. "Good boy," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "Good boy, Max, you knew all along, didn't you?" The realization of what could have happened hit him then. If Max had gone into his kennel as usual that night, he would have been bitten, possibly multiple times. Out here, miles from town and veterinary care, such an encounter would almost certainly have been fatal. Max had not only saved himself but had tried to keep Thomas from getting too close as well. The dog had spent a night in freezing temperatures, enduring discomfort and even pain, rather than abandoning his vigil. "You stubborn, wonderful dog," Thomas said, moving carefully back toward Max and away from the kennel. "You saved both our lives." The dog seemed to relax slightly now that Thomas was moving away from the danger, though he continued to watch the kennel warily. Thomas's hands were shaking, partly from the cold and partly from the shock of what he'd discovered. He needed to deal with the snake, but the how of it wasn't immediately clear. In warmer months, he might have tried to encourage it to move along, but in this weather the reptile wouldn't survive long outside the warmth of the kennel. His phone still showed no signal, so calling animal control wasn't an option. Besides, with the roads likely impassable after the storm, it could be days before anyone could reach them. As Thomas considered his options, Max pressed against his leg, a warm, solid presence that steadied him. The dog looked up at him with complete trust, as if to say, "Now that you know, you'll fix it." "We need help," Thomas decided aloud. His nearest neighbor, Jack Wilson, lived about 3 miles away and was known locally for his skill at safely relocating problem wildlife. Jack kept several terrariums in his workshop and had been known to shelter rattlesnakes during winter, until they could be safely released in spring. Getting to Jack's place wouldn't be easy in these conditions, but Thomas's old snowmobile was in the shed, and if the roads were too drifted for that, he could potentially make the journey on his cross-country skis. "Come on," he told Max, patting the dog's head. "Let's get back inside and make a plan." They retreated to the cabin where Thomas immediately poured food and fresh water for Max. The dog deserved that and more after his night-long vigil. As Max ate hungrily, Thomas called Jack's number repeatedly, hoping the cell service might return sporadically. On the 6th try, the call connected, though the connection was poor. Thomas quickly explained the situation, raising his voice to be heard through the static. "Rattler, in this weather?" Jack's voice crackled through the phone. "That's a new one. Hang tight, I'll come to you. Got the snowplow attachment on my truck. Might take a couple hours to dig through, but I'll get there." Relief washed over Thomas as he ended the call. He sat heavily in his chair by the fire, the events of the past day and night catching up to him all at once. Max, having finished his meal, came to sit beside him, resting his head on Thomas's knee. "You know," Thomas said, running his hand over Max's fur, "most people would say you were just acting on instinct, that you smelled the snake or heard it when I couldn't." He paused, looking into the dog's intelligent eyes. "But it was more than that, wasn't it? You were making choices. Hard ones." Max's tail thumped against the floor once, twice. "You chose to stay out in that storm even though you were freezing, because you knew what was in that kennel," Thomas continued. "And you tried to keep me away from it too. That's not just instinct. That's—" He struggled to find the right word. "That's something else." Outside, the sun climbed higher in a perfectly clear sky, making the snow-covered landscape blindingly bright. The storm had passed and help was on the way. In a few hours, Jack would arrive and deal with the snake, and life would return to normal. Except Thomas knew that something had fundamentally changed. His understanding of Max, of what the dog was capable of, had shifted. There had been intelligence in the animal's actions, and more than that, there had been devotion and sacrifice. "You saved my life." Thomas said simply, his throat tight with emotion. And you nearly froze to death doing it. Max lifted his head at the change in Thomas's tone, ears perking forward. Don't worry, Thomas assured him, scratching that special spot behind Max's left ear. No more sleeping outside for you. Not after this. From now on, your place is right here. As if understanding the promise, Max sighed contentedly and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest after his long vigil in the snow. The sound of an engine broke the afternoon quiet, and Thomas moved to the window to see Jack's red pickup pushing through the snow-covered drive, its plow attachment creating high banks on either side. Max joined him at the window, his tail wagging slightly at the sight of a visitor but his body still tense, as if he hadn't fully relaxed since their discovery. He made it, Thomas told Max, patting the dog's head. We'll get this sorted out now. Jack Wilson was a burly man in his 60s with a full white beard and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He climbed down from his truck wearing what looked like every piece of winter clothing he owned, giving him the appearance of a particularly round snowman. Some storm, eh? Jack called as Thomas opened the door. Roads are a mess. Took me nearly 3 hours to get here and it's only 3 miles. Thomas welcomed him inside, where Jack immediately crouched to greet Max. The dog allowed a quick pat but then moved back to the window, his attention still fixed on the distant kennel. Still on guard duty, I see, Jack remarked. Smart animal you've got there. Smarter than I knew, Thomas agreed, pouring coffee for both of them. He quickly brought Jack up to speed on everything that had happened, from Max's initial refusal to enter the kennel to their discovery that morning. Jack whistled low. That's something else. Dog spent all night in a blizzard rather than abandon his post. He looked at Max with newfound respect. You don't see that kind of dedication every day. After finishing their coffee and gathering the necessary equipment from Jack's truck, heavy gloves, long-handled snake tongs, and a specialized transport container, the two men made their way toward the kennel. Max followed at a distance, no longer trying to block their path but clearly still cautious. You stay back, Thomas told the dog firmly. We've got this now. Jack approached the kennel with the confidence of experience, peering inside with a powerful flashlight. Yep, there she is. Big female by the looks of it, probably 5 or 6 years old. With practiced movements, Jack used the snake tongs to carefully grasp the rattlesnake behind its head. The reptile rattled angrily but was unable to strike as Jack gently but firmly lifted it from the kennel and placed it in the transport container. There we go, Jack said, securing the lid. She'll be comfortable in my workshop until spring. Got a nice warm terrarium all set up. Thomas felt a wave of relief as the container was stowed safely in Jack's truck. The source of danger that Max had so vigilantly guarded against was finally removed, and the tension that had hung in the air for the past day seemed to dissipate. I can't thank you enough, Thomas told Jack. Don't mention it, Jack replied, climbing into his truck. But you know, this is quite a story. Mind if I share it with the folks at the general store? They get a kick out of hearing about Max's night in the snow. Thomas looked at Max, who had finally relaxed and was now sitting calmly at his side. Sure, go ahead. He deserves some recognition for what he did. As Jack's truck disappeared down the drive, Thomas knelt beside Max, looking the dog directly in the eyes. It's over now. You did good, boy. Really good. Max licked his hand once, then turned and walked confidently back to the cabin as if to say, I know. Now can we please get back to normal? Normal, however, had shifted. That night, without discussion or debate, Max jumped onto Thomas's bed and settled at his feet. Thomas, who had previously been somewhat strict about where the dog was allowed to sleep, said nothing. After what Max had endured to keep them both safe, the rules seemed less important somehow. Over the next few days, as roads cleared and life in their small Montana community resumed its winter rhythm, Thomas heard from several neighbors. Jack had indeed shared the story, and it had spread quickly through town. People called or stopped by, ostensibly to check that Thomas had weathered the storm all right, but really to hear firsthand about Max's remarkable behavior. I always said that dog of yours was special, Mrs. Patterson from the bakery told him when he finally made it into town for supplies. She slipped an extra dog biscuit into his bag, her special recipe that Max particularly loved. At the hardware store, Thomas found himself surrounded by a small group of locals, all eager to hear the tale. He told it simply, without embellishment, but the story needed no exaggeration. A dog who had spent a night in a blizzard to warn his owner of danger was extraordinary enough on its own. Smart animals. German shepherds. Bill from the feed store commented. But even so, that's something else. You ought to get him one of those special medals they give to hero dogs. Thomas laughed it off, but the suggestion stayed with him. Not the medal part. Max wouldn't care about that, mine. But the idea of doing something special to recognize what the dog had done. The opportunity came a week later when the local newspaper, a small weekly publication that served their county, contacted Thomas about featuring Max in their local Heroes section, a column typically reserved for volunteer, firefighters, or kids who had done remarkable community service. The reporter who came to interview them was a young woman with a genuine love of animals that Max immediately sensed, allowing her to pet him and even shake his paw for a photo. Thomas watched with pride as Max posed patiently, seeming to understand that something important was happening. "We'd like to put him on the front page, if that's all right," the reporter told Thomas. "It's not often we get to feature a four-legged hero." The following Saturday, Thomas drove into town early to pick up a copy of the paper. There was Max on the front page, looking dignified and somewhat serious. Under the headline, "Local Dog Braves Blizzard to Protect Owner from Danger." The article detailed Max's night in the snow, the discovery of the rattlesnake, and included quotes from Jack and several other locals about the dog's extraordinary actions. Thomas bought 10 copies, though he wasn't entirely sure what he would do with them all. It just felt right to commemorate the moment. "What do you think?" he asked Max when they got home, showing him the paper. "You're famous now." Max sniffed the newspaper briefly, then wandered off to look out the window, apparently unimpressed by his newfound celebrity. That afternoon, Thomas began working on a project he'd been planning since the incident, a new kennel for Max. Though the dog now slept inside most nights, Thomas wanted him to have a secure outdoor space for times when he needed to be away from the cabin for longer periods. The new design was similar to the old one in size and insulation, but with one crucial difference. The entire front panel was made of thick, transparent polycarbonate, allowing Max to see clearly inside before entering. Thomas also positioned it closer to the cabin, within view of the kitchen window. "No more surprises," Thomas told Max as they inspected the completed structure together several days later. "What do you think?" Max approached the new kennel cautiously at first, sniffing around its perimeter. Then, as if making a decision, he walked inside, turned around once and laid down, his eyes still visible through the clear panel. After a moment, he got up and came back out, apparently satisfied with the arrangement. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new pattern. Max still used his kennel occasionally during the day, especially when the weather was mild, but each night he took his place at the foot of Thomas's bed without question or command. It had become his right, earned during those long, freezing hours in the snow. The story of Max's vigilance spread beyond their small town, picked up by a regional news station that sent a crew to film a short segment about the heroic dog. Max tolerated the attention with dignity, though Thomas could tell he was relieved when the cameras finally left and quiet returned to their home. "Not one for the spotlight, are you?" Thomas asked as they sat together on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the snow-covered landscape. "Makes two of us." Max rested his head on Thomas's knee, his eyes half closed in contentment. The bond between them had always been strong, but it had been transformed by their shared experience, deepened into something that went beyond the usual connection between man and dog. In that quiet moment, Thomas found himself thinking of Helen and what she would say if she could see them now. "You were right," he whispered, both to her memory and to the dog at his side. "Every country home does need a good dog." Max's ears twitched at his voice, and the dog looked up with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than Thomas had ever given him credit for. "Though good doesn't quite cover it, does it?" Thomas added, running his hand along Max's back. "Not even close." As if in agreement, Max shifted closer, his warm weight a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest moments, loyalty and love could be enough to see you through to morning.